This video will cover the lecture notes for Chapter 12, titled The South Expands Slavery in Society, time period 1800 to 1860. We will discuss in this video the first section, the domestic slave trade. Before talking about the domestic slave trade, we need to eventually talk about why this came to be. Why was there a need for a domestic slave trade? First off, we need to understand that the United States eventually ends its participation in the transatlantic slave trade in 1809. And even though there were still slaves coming in, African slaves coming in through Florida or Texas, there was still not enough. That illegal importation was not sufficient in providing the amount of slaves that were needed. Another reason for the need for a domestic slave trade is that the impact of technology with the congen that's going to increase the need for slaves. While it was going to limit the amount of work that was needed, that eventually spurred slave owners to wanting to grow more cotton to make more of a profit now that it was easier to clean. And so that's one of the inventions that eventually impacted the need for more slaves. But also, you look at different technology in textiles, like different spins, new spins, the steamboat for transportation. So all these things came to be and made an impact, needing a domestic slave trade. So now let's talk about the actual domestic slave trade. So the slaves growing in the Chesapeake Bay, Chesapeake region, were eventually growing naturally. That means that more and more slave couples were having children, therefore more slaves were created. So what you create there is a surplus of slaves, uh, especially because of the crop that they're working on. Tobacco is not labor intensive crop like cotton is, or sugar, or rice. So you're gonna see that these slaves are not being worked right at the level that slaves from the deep south are eventually being worked. For the plantation owners, the slave owners, this was a win-win situation. There was a demand in the south. There was a surplus in the north, so northern part of the southern states or southern region, and therefore it was a win-win situation because both of them were going to make money. The upper south was gonna make more money by selling their slaves, and the South was going to make more money by profiting from the work that these slaves were going to do. And so the Upper South really saw an opportunity, right? When you have an excess of something, you can get rid of, especially when plantation owners and slave owners have that mentality that slaves are just property. So to them, it's like selling an excess of horses or cows or wheelbarrows, whatever the property is. They feel like it's an excess, they can make a profit out of it and eventually still be happy, not thinking about the human element of breakup of families. To them, it was just business, it was profit, right? So you can see like Virginia, they're gonna sell just in 1860, they're gonna sell over 440,000 slaves are gonna be eventually sent south. And so you're going to see a lot of movement of slaves, not just slaves, but also slave owners or plantation owners that are looking for better opportunities. While they may have a nice profit in the upper south, they if they're greedy and are going to need or want more money, they're going to go either deep south or southwest or even west to Texas to establish a cotton plantation. And also, you got to look into that at this time, the upper south main crop, which is tobacco, eventually is going to lose profit. It's not going to have the same impact that it had before, mainly because other places, because of wars like the American Revolution, the War of 1812, interrupted, right, the production of tobacco. So Europeans had to look elsewhere to find their tobacco. So there is a decline in the need for tobacco. Therefore, there's also there an excess of slaves, but also you start to see that you need to move. Plantationers begin to move west or southwest. So when you look at the the percentages, right, of transfers to sales. Transfers, as if you saw in the book, is basically when they're gifted, right? A father is gifting this amount of slaves to their children who have grown up and are married, and they're gonna go and start their life. So you see that 40% of the people who move to this new region, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, they are going to be moved because of transferred. They were given gifted to somebody else, or the owner of that slave eventually moved as well to that location. And the other percentage, 60%, are going to be sold to the south. And so there's really two systems that come into play. You have the inland system and the coastal system of selling these slaves. So one thing to remember, there's this movement of upper south slaves moving to the south. It's going to expand the population in southern states. So you see that between Georgia and Texas in the deep south, you eventually see that 1 in 3 Southerners in the deep south are going to be slaves. So there's a huge population that eventually is growing in the deep south. So you can see here, right, in this map, this idea of this visual, how it was in 1790, right? You can kind of see the amount of slaves. Then you eventually see here where there's more slaves in 1830, but then by 1860 you eventually see a lot more spread across in the south. Some of these areas in 1830s were still empty, but once you see over here, it's more and more populated with slaves. And then you eventually see that the need for cotton, as I mentioned, the you can see this growth, and really the growth begins to take off really when plantation owners began to implement or use the cotton gin. That really spurred that change. And you can see here how the light blue, there's more of it as time progresses because that's the amount. There's more people who are going to be moving from their location because they're being sold. And again, it's just a visual, right, to see those who were practicing slavery and those who were not, and you can see that that could eventually come to a conflict between Americans. As I mentioned earlier, this was in terms of for planters, for slave owners, a win-win situation. Um, like I said, Chesapeake plantation owners are who stay there will make a profit because they sell off excess slaves, and those who sell their plantation and move to the west, southwest, are also going to make a profit because eventually they already have the amount of slaves that they need, so they don't sell them off. They don't sell their excess slaves because they're going to move to the west where they will be needed. So they're going to make profits. So definitely there's going to be an increase of wealth in the Chesapeake region by these two means, either selling the slaves or selling their plantation owners and moving to grow more profits, right, in the Southwest. Just to give you kind of a perspective, a slave was sold for $1,000. That's at the lowest cost, right? Some of them were sold for more, as I'll show in a visual later on. $1,000 in today's money is close to it's over $33,000. So there's a lot of buying power with that $1,000 back in the 1850s. So there's two systems, like I mentioned earlier, the coastal trade system and the inland trade system. And basically the idea is that the coastal system different ports like Charlestown, Savannah, Georgia, are going to also Virginia are going to be moving slaves through water, right, and move and eventually dropping them off in Louisiana. And I'll explain that in the video that I have in a little bit. In the inland system, basically, you had speculators literally browse through villages and towns and, hey, are you selling this kid, are you selling that kid, to be able to buy them off and then taking them to the deep south and selling them. The idea is that the coastal system was more visual than the inland system. Therefore, it got more attacks by abolitionists from the north. But the idea is that more and more slaves were growing as time progressed from the 1830s to 1850s. States like Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, they're going to be growing their slave populations. So in the inland system that was created, eventually moved slaves inland, right? And they would form them in coffles, which is basically you put them in a line and you just start to move them, right? Uh, and they're on display, but they literally have to walk from the upper south to the deep south. And this is this map that shows you the domestic slave trade. Here's the coastal system that you see here, and then you have the inland system that is used to move slaves. And the slave trade, the domestic slave trade, eventually revealed to the slaves and to Northerners how vulnerable these slaves were. That they were literally just property. You can think about those slaves in the Upper South that had been living for generations and generations. Peacefully, having their kids, growing their family, and so on. And then here comes the domestic slave trade, and now they're broken up because their plantation owners eventually sold them. And the idea is that there's this chattel principle: you're just property. That slaves were just property. That's nothing else. At the end of the day, it's all about profit. It's business. It's not about getting your feelings involved. It's about making money. And so that is something that slaves had to live with, for their time and their duration as slaves. Slave marriages are going to be broken down. Families are getting torn apart. By the slave trade. Even with these drawbacks and challenges and nightmares, really, for slaves, the slave family, the African American communities, was really bonded together and really made became closer. But something to think about is that for slaves, right, that were in slavehood, there was no happy moment that lasted, because at they could be feeling that happy moment at the time, but in the back of their mind, they're still thinking, this could end right now, tomorrow, in a few days, where my family could be broken up. And so that's something that they experience, right? The being separated from your wife or from your husband, being separated from your children, right? So those are hardships that eventually, as I remember, as I talked in class, this is generational trauma that will pass from generation to generation. The loss of family, the loss of loved ones. And plantation owners felt like they were benevolent. They took care of the family, but the reality was that they were not. For them, benevolent masters was that they took care of the family, even the slaves, and that they would only punish the slaves, those who eventually were transported or transferred elsewhere, were those that were bad. So they were included sometimes in families, right, as the caretaker, and children saw them as a family member, but at the end of the day, they were still property. They were sold as a horse would be sold or a pig will be sold. They didn't care if they separated the mother from the child, and that was something difficult to see, right? No real human element involved in this. And as you can see in this diagram, you can see the different prices: 2100, 1600, 1800, for slaves. But it's just, this slavery really created this um, and the families.